I'm now joined here in the studio by Kanni, who is the director of the United Nations Development Operations Coordinations Office, who's here to discuss hacking big systems and innovation within organizations like the UN. Welcome.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
It's great to have you with us. It's a busy week ahead at the United Nations.
Indeed.
Indeed. So thank you for making time. Tell us a bit about the work that your office does.
Well, it's a small group that brings together about 40 different UN agencies working behind the Sustainable Development Goals and trying to work differently in an age that requires us to understand much more about the new technologies out there, etc. So we're coming a long way in a shared space with a lot of others.
It's so interesting because we obviously have a live stream throughout the day and a live feed, and a lot of people are actually asking about how do you actually innovate in big systems where it just seems so impossible to identify where to begin in innovating these systems. So I'm curious to know, what type of innovations do you look at when it comes to big structures like the UN system? What does that innovation ecosystem look like at the UN?
Well, the good thing is, since we're working in about 165 countries, a lot of the ideas come from there. And so it's the bottom-up approach of saying, what are the issues that we've got to tackle today, actually has us reimagining the United Nations. This is not the United Nations of the 40s, right, where we could work in our separate silos. Today, the challenges behind any of these SDGs are so tough and complex that you've got to break through these old institutional architectures and regulations and policies and say, what is it that allows us to actually put together a very different package of support to get to people who need us most? Because those are the ones who are left behind.
It's so fascinating because I think a lot of what we've been talking about through the day is localization. It's how do you take these ideas that start at big institutions and allow them to trickle into kind of places where they matter, in the sense of policy that's designed matters in the field. How do you, in the work that you do, start to approach thinking through kind of the process and the strategy of innovation, both looking at the picture and the structure to how it's implemented at the end?
Well, we start with very concrete issues, right? So for example, if you're thinking of health for all and those indicators, better maternal health, every child immunized, you've got to ask, how do you get to them? And so local action with new technologies makes this possible, right? And that means taking that back and changing our policies. We would never have been discussing drone drops of medication and antibiotics and retrovirals and antimalarial to communities that couldn't get them before. We would not be talking cashless societies in rural communities, but this is the case. Now, we've got to then go back and change our own institutional policies, regulations to work with these challenges.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think there's a lot of young people here who are asking, and it's something that we've been thinking about a lot as the Global People Summit. How do you start to allow young voices to enter into these systems? And there's quite a few people here from different communities, because our session was just on education, that are thinking about how. And it's easy to talk about getting youth voices involved, but how do you think that could be approached in infusing that?
Well, there are a couple of ways. One is that instead of going back to our old data sources, right, and old, very dusty reams of paper when it comes to innovation, it's collective intelligence. I mean, look at the social movements out there, right? Even our governance conversations have to change. And a lot of these social movements, not all of them headed to positive, but many are young people saying we are reimagining our countries and our place in those countries. And they're leading these. So it's not the single leader in these movements. It's groups of young people. And it's getting that energy in through all of our programs and everything we do to really change the way we engage with a new generation. Just look at most of Africa and Asia. The average age is now, the median age is in the 20s and 30s. We've got to be relevant to those people's futures.
So I'm curious on what you think needs to happen to actually create that ecosystem, though. What does that capacity look like that needs to be built in order to enable that change to happen?
Right. Well, some of it is bringing new young skills into our own systems. right? We've got to kind of be much more out there bringing that in.
And that's to the UN systems.
Into the UN system. But second, and more importantly, we've got to open up and partner with many more institutions, particularly institutions that have a lot of young people, and not necessarily institutions we're used to partnering with, because they don't quite look like traditional institutions. These are movements, these are groups, and we've got to open up those spaces to let them come in and often lead, and we've got to follow. So being humble while being ambitious to get to some of these issues with them, I think is going to be a real challenge, but it's what's going to reimagine our new United Nations.
So it's really fascinating because you said kind of the being bold yet being grounded. And I think oftentimes young people are critiqued for having such big dreams but not having their feet planted on the ground. As they say, your head is in the cloud but your feet aren't planted on the ground. So I'm curious, as you start to think of innovating within the UN system, how do you retain and hold on to the important parts of the policy and the important parts of the bureaucracy that people may not understand that are critical, because that's decision-making processes, while also creating space for innovation, because those can both happen simultaneously.
Exactly. We've got to walk on both feet, right? So yes, it may not be very sexy to say, well, throw out the bureaucracy and everything, but there's a lot of wisdom built up there on how to work with 193 governments, how to bring them together. I mean, they created these Sustainable Development Goals. Who would have thought, right, that governments can come together and agree behind this amazing agenda? So you're very right. There's a balance between getting all excited and opening up to new technologies, to looking at, from automation to genetic engineering to all the new research in biomedical, et cetera, and managing to put that in ways that frame better targeting, new laws, changes in constitutions that have to look at more equal ways of doing things. Because to me, one of the biggest things the UN brings is a norm-based culture. And the set that at the end of the day, our values shouldn't change. Technology can change, skill sets have to change, but core fundamental values, that everyone's equal and fairness and justice, this has to stay the same.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. And we are very, very proud and happy to have you here, and the work that you are doing is really magnificent in both changing inside and outside the system. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you.